At the family dinner, my daughter shouted, "My mom smells like pee and poo." Everyone laughed. I stood up in silence, kicked her out of my house and threw her clothes on the curb. Humiliation has a price. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The arrangement, like most bad ideas, had been born from a place of love and loneliness. A year after my husband Charles had passed away, the silence in our large four-bedroom house had become a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief. The echoes of his laughter were gone, replaced by the solitary ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My daughter Chloe had suggested it. She and her husband Derek were living in a cramped, overpriced apartment downtown, saving for a down payment on a house of their own, a goal that seemed to perpetually recede into the distance like a desert mirage. "You're here all alone, Mom," she'd said one Sunday, her voice a smooth, reasonable balm of concern. "And we're just throwing money away on rent. Why don't we move in with you for a year, just until we get on our feet? We can help with the bills, keep you company. It would be perfect for all of us." And in my lonely, grief-stricken state, it had sounded perfect. I had visions of a bustling, multi-generational home, of my grandchildren's laughter filling the empty rooms, of shared meals and a renewed sense of purpose. I saw it as a life raft for them and for me, so I had agreed, my heart full of a foolish, hopeful optimism. That had been 2 years ago. The year had stretched on indefinitely. The help with the bills had never materialized, and the company I was beginning to realize was a price far too high to pay. The arrangement had become a slow, creeping occupation, and I, the homeowner, was being systematically relegated to the role of an unpaid and increasingly invisible staff member. My name is Martha Green. For 35 years I was a palliative care nurse. My life was spent in the quiet, sacred spaces of the dying, a world where dignity was the final, most precious currency. Now, at 60, I was a widow in a house that no longer felt like my own, serving a daughter who had forgotten the meaning of the word. Before I was a mother, before I was a widow, I was a nurse. It was not just a job, it was the core of my identity. Palliative care is a strange and sacred calling. It is not about fighting death but about easing its passage. It is about providing comfort, managing pain, and above all, preserving the dignity of a person in their final, most vulnerable moments. The insult, when it came, would not just be about a smell. It would be a desecration of this history, a repudiation of my life's work. I remember one patient, a man named Mr. Henderson. He was a retired history professor, a brilliant, witty man trapped in a body that was failing him with a cruel, methodical slowness. He was incontinent, a condition that caused him a deep, profound shame. He would apologize, his voice a weak, papery whisper, every time I had to clean him, his eyes averted, his face a mask of humiliation. I would always take my time. I would close the door, draw the curtains, and speak to him in a low, gentle voice, not about the unpleasant task at hand, but about the books on his shelf, about the political news of the day, about anything that would allow him to travel, in his mind, away from the indignity of his body. "It's just a body, Mr. Henderson," I would tell him softly as I worked, my hands efficient and gentle. "It's a machine that's getting a little worn out. It has nothing to do with you, with the brilliant mind in that head of yours." The smells of my job were not pleasant. They were the raw, unfiltered, and often difficult scents of the human body in its final, messy chapter. But to me, they were never just smells. They were the clinical, honest indicators of a life winding down. They were a part of the sacred, difficult work of care. I had learned to associate them not with disgust, but with a deep and almost holy sense of purpose. I was the keeper of dignity. I was the guardian of a peaceful end. I sat with Mr. Henderson on the night he died. His family was not there. I held his frail, cool hand, my thumb rubbing gentle circles on his paper-thin skin. The room was clean, the lights were dim, and the only smell was the faint, clean scent of the lotion I had used on his hands. He died peacefully, with a quiet sigh, his dignity intact. That was my life's work. For 35 years I had washed, cleaned, and cared for the bodies of strangers, and I had done it with a profound sense of respect and honor. I had willingly and lovingly taken on the tasks that others could not bear. My hands, my heart, my very being were steeped in the difficult, beautiful, and deeply human work of dying, and that I had always believed was a thing of honor. The first year had been a honeymoon of sorts. Chloe and Derek had been effusively grateful, their "thank you, Mom's" a constant, reassuring refrain. They brought a chaotic, youthful energy to the house that for a time felt like a balm on my grief. But gratitude, I soon learned, has a short shelf life. The year of saving for a down payment came and went. Derek's ventures, a series of ill-conceived and quickly abandoned startup ideas, never seemed to materialize into an actual income. Chloe's salary as a social media manager was good, but it was not enough to fund the lavish lifestyle they felt they deserved. And so they stayed. And as they stayed, the gratitude slowly, almost imperceptibly eroded, replaced by a creeping casual disrespect. My role in the household shifted. I was no longer the benevolent matriarch, offering sanctuary to her struggling children. I was the leave-in, unpaid help. It started with small things. Chloe would leave her coffee mug on the antique cherrywood table in the living room, a table my husband had lovingly refinished himself. When I would gently remind her to use a coaster, she would sigh, a long theatrical put-upon sound. "Mom, it's just a table, don't be so precious." Derek began to borrow my car, a reliable and well-maintained sedan, for his meetings, often returning it late at night with the gas tank on empty, and the interior littered with his fast food wrappers. He never asked, he just took the keys from the hook by the door as if it were his own. Then came the children. My grandchildren, whom I adored, were slowly being taught that I was not their grandmother, but their servant. "Go ask Nana to get you a snack," Chloe would say, without looking up from her phone. "Nana will clean it up," Derek would reassure them when they spilled juice on the rug. My cooking, which had once been a source of family pride, became a subject of their casual critique. It was old-fashioned, too heavy. They began to fill my refrigerator with expensive organic gluten-free ingredients that I had no idea how to use, and then complain when I fell back on my familiar comforting recipes. The disrespect was 1,000 small cuts, a slow, steady erosion of my status in my own home. I was becoming invisible, a background utility, the quiet, reliable engine that kept their comfortable lives running. I told myself it was for the family. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself it was better than being alone. But with every condescending sigh, with every empty gas tank, with every mess I was left to clean, a small cold knot of resentment was beginning to form in my chest. The announcement came on a Monday evening. Chloe walked into the kitchen where I was preparing dinner, a triumphant, self-satisfied smile on her face. She was waving her phone like a trophy. "Big news, Mom," she said. "I've been given the new Sterling account at work. It's a huge deal, and my boss, Mr. Albright, and his wife are coming for dinner on Saturday. Derek's new potential business partner is coming too, so we need to be on our A game. Everything has to be perfect." I understood immediately. This was not a casual family dinner. This was a performance. A high-stakes professional showcase designed to project an image of effortless, upscale success. And the stage for this performance was to be my home. And I, it was clear, was to be the unpaid, uncredited stage manager. For the next 5 days, my quiet, peaceful home was transformed into a high-stress production office. Chloe was a whirlwind of anxious, controlling energy, a director on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She vetoed my menu suggestions with a wave of her hand. "No, Mom. Not roast chicken. It's so basic. I'll email you a recipe for a sea bass with a fennel puree. It's what they serve at a new restaurant downtown. Very She critiqued my table settings. "Are these our only wine glasses? They're so thick. We need something more delicate. And for God's sake, we can't use your old floral china. It's so dated. I'll rent some simple white plates." She rearranged my living room furniture, moving the comfortable, well-loved pieces I had shared with my husband, and replacing them with a stark, modern aesthetic she deemed more sophisticated. My hand-knitted Afghan was folded and hidden away. The family photos on the mantelpiece were replaced with a single abstract art print she had borrowed from a friend. Through it all, I said nothing. I simply did as I was told. I shopped for the exotic, expensive ingredients for her chic menu. I polished the silver, I washed and ironed the rented linen napkins. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent pair of hands working to construct a reality that was not my own, a reality in which I was completely invisible. Derek, for his part, was her enthusiastic co-conspirator. He saw this dinner as his own big chance to impress his potential partner, to finally launch one of his ventures. "This is it, babe," I heard him say to Chloe one night, when they thought I was out of earshot. "If we land this, we'll finally be out of here. No more living under your mom's roof." The casual cruelty of his words was a physical blow. They were not just using my home as a stage, they were actively eagerly planning their escape from it, and from me. The pressure mounted with each passing day. The word perfect became Chloe's mantra, a weapon she used to control every detail, to criticize every effort. The flowers aren't right, Mom. The sauce needs to be smoother. The house needs to be perfect. By Saturday morning I was exhausted. I had been cooking and cleaning for 12 hours a day, a silent unpaid servant in the service of my daughter's ambition, and the most painful part was that she didn't even see it. She did not see my sacrifice. She only saw the flaws in the performance. On the afternoon of the dinner party, my sister Denise stopped by. Denise was my polar opposite. Where I was quiet and patient, she was loud, opinionated, and had a tongue as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She was a high school principal, a woman who had spent a lifetime dealing with entitled teenagers and their even more entitled parents, and she had no time for nonsense. She walked into my kitchen to a scene of controlled chaos. I was at the stove, my face flushed from the heat, simultaneously trying to reduce a complex sauce and keep a tray of delicate canapés from burning. Chloe was at the island, arranging flowers in a minimalist vase, her brow furrowed in a state of high-strung artistic concentration. "Hey Marty," Denise said, her voice a cheerful booming contrast to the tense silence of the room. She kissed my cheek and then looked at the frantic scene, her sharp eyes taking in everything, my exhausted face, the mountain of dirty pots and pans, and Chloe's serene, self-important focus on the flowers. "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with an irony that was completely lost on Chloe. "Big party tonight? Looks like you've got the whole catering staff here." "Denise," Chloe said, not looking up from her arrangement, "I'm trying to concentrate. These peonies are not cooperating." Denise ignored her and turned to me. "What can I do to help, sis? You look like you're about to drop." "I'm fine, Denny," I said, forcing a weary smile. "Just a few more things to finish up." Just then Chloe let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. "Mom, did you get the Chilean sea bass, like I asked? Or did you get the regular sea bass? Because the Chilean has a much higher fat content. It will be more buttery. It's what the recipe called for." "I got the Chilean," I said, my voice tight. "It cost a fortune, but I got it." "Good," Chloe said, still not looking at me. "I don't want anything to go wrong tonight. This is important." Denise stared at her niece, her mouth a thin, hard line. She waited until Chloe had finished her arrangement, and had swept out of the room to get ready. Then she turned to me. "Are you going to let her talk to you like that?" she asked, her voice a low, furious growl. "In your own kitchen? In the house you own? Criticizing the food you are cooking for her fancy friends?" "She's just stressed, Denise," I said, the familiar, tired excuse. "This dinner is a big deal for her and Derek." Denise snorted, a sound of pure unadulterated disbelief. "Stressed? That's not stress, Marty. That's entitlement. That's a 35-year-old woman treating her own mother like a hired hand. You're a saint, you really are." She came and stood next to me at the stove, her presence a solid, comforting wall of righteous anger. She picked up a dish towel and began to dry the pile of pots I had just washed. "But you know what happens to saints, don't you?" she said, her voice low and serious. "They get martyred. They get taken for granted until there's nothing left. You're letting that girl and her useless husband treat your home like a hotel, and you like the staff. How long are you going to let this go on?" Her words were a direct hit, a perfect articulation of the ugly truth I had been trying so hard to ignore. I had no answer for her. "I know you're lonely," she said, her voice softening, the anger replaced by a deep sisterly concern, "but there's a difference between being lonely and being a doormat. Charles would be spinning in his grave if he saw this." She was right. She was right about everything, but I didn't know how to stop it. The dynamic had been set, the roles cast. I was the caregiver, they were the dependents, and the line of respect had been so gradually, so insidiously eroded, that I no longer knew how to rebuild it. I just kept my head down, focused on the simmering sauce, and prayed that I could get through this one perfect night. As the guests began to arrive, a strange and deeply unsettling transformation occurred. Chloe and Derek, who had been a whirlwind of anxious, demanding energy all week, suddenly became the very picture of relaxed, gracious hosts. They stood by the door, their smiles bright and welcoming, their voices a smooth, charming murmur. They were actors, taking the stage for their opening scene, and their performance was flawless. The guests were, as Chloe had promised, an impressive bunch. There was her boss, Mr. Albright, a powerful silver-haired man with a shrewd, watchful eye, and his elegantly dressed wife. There was Derek's potential business partner, a slick, self-important man who introduced himself as a venture catalyst. And there were a few other couples, all of them radiating the quiet, confident aura of wealth and success. I, who had cooked the entire multi-course meal that was perfuming the house with the delicious scents of roasting fish and savory herbs, was not part of the welcoming committee. I was in the kitchen, frantically plating the delicate, ridiculously complicated canapés Chloe had insisted upon. When the first platter was ready, I smoothed my simple black apron, took a deep breath, and walked into the living room. Chloe saw me enter, and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent command from the director to a member of the crew. "Oh, the appetizers are here," she announced to the room, her voice bright and cheerful. She did not introduce me. She did not say, "My mother, who is a wonderful cook, has prepared these for us." She said, "The appetizers are here," as if they had materialized by magic. I moved through the room, a silent, smiling specter, offering the platter to the guests. They took the small bites of food, murmuring their thanks, their eyes sliding over me without a flicker of recognition. I was not a person, I was a function. I was the hand that delivered the food. For the next hour, that was my role. I shuttled between the hot, chaotic kitchen and the cool, elegant dining room. I refilled wine glasses, my hand steady as I poured the expensive French ansat Chloe had selected. I cleared away empty plates. I brought out the main course, the perfectly cooked Chilean sea bass, and served it to each guest. Through it all, my daughter and her husband never once acknowledged my existence, except to give me a subtle gesture or a whispered command. "Dad's glass is empty," Chloe would murmur as I passed. "We'll need more bread on the table," Derek would signal with a flick of his eyes. They were so skilled at it, so practiced in the art of making me invisible. To their guests I was simply the help, a hired caterer or a housekeeper who was assisting with the party. The thought was so profoundly, deeply humiliating that I had to retreat to the kitchen for a moment and grip the edge of the sink, my knuckles white, just to keep my composure. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent, unpaid servant at a party I had single-handedly catered. I was a stranger, serving food to other strangers, while my own daughter, the center of this glittering false universe, pretended I didn't exist. The humiliation was a slow burning fire in my gut, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was rapidly approaching my breaking point. I was in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, about to bring out the platter of roasted Brussels sprouts, when a voice, warm and respectful, cut through the haze of my humiliation. "Excuse me, you're Mrs. Green, aren't you?" I turned. One of the guests, a kind-faced man in his late 50s, was standing up from his seat at the table and walking toward me. He was not one of Derek's friends. I recognized him as a colleague of Chloe's boss, a man I had briefly met at a company picnic years ago. "Yes, I am," I said, a little surprised to be addressed directly. He extended his hand, his smile genuine, and full of a warmth that was entirely absent from the rest of the room. "I'm David Chun. We met once. A long time ago. I work with Bill Albright. But I know you from somewhere else too." He paused, a look of respectful recognition dawning on his face. "You were my father's nurse. 5 years ago, at the hospice wing of St. James." The memory came flooding back. His father had been a quiet, dignified man, a retired librarian who had faced his final days with a profound and gentle grace. I had been his primary care nurse for the last 2 weeks of his life. "I remember your father," I said, my voice softening. "He was a lovely man. He told me all about his collection of first edition poetry books." David's eyes welled up with a film of grateful tears. "He loved his books," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and he loved you. You were so good to him. I've never forgotten the kindness and the dignity you showed him, and our whole family, in his final days, the way you spoke to him, the care you took. You were an angel to us. I wanted to thank you." His words, his simple, heartfelt acknowledgement of my life's work, were like a sudden brilliant ray of sunshine in the cold, dark room of my despair. For a brief, beautiful moment, I was not the invisible, unpaid help. I was not the woman who smelled of cleaning supplies and cooking fumes. I was Martha Green, RN, a woman whose life had had purpose and meaning, a woman who had made a difference in the world. The conversation at the table had faltered, the guests turning their attention to the quiet, emotional scene unfolding in the doorway. Chloe's boss, Mr. Albright, was smiling, a look of genuine respect on his face. My sister Denise was beaming at me with a fierce, proud love. The spotlight, for the first time all night, had shifted. It was no longer on Chloe, the perfect hostess. It was on me, the quiet, humble woman in the apron who had, it turned out, a far more profound and respectable history than anyone in the room had imagined. The humiliation I had been feeling began to recede, replaced by a flicker of my old, quiet pride, and it was this small, unexpected moment of recognition that would become the spark that lit the final, explosive fuse. Chloe, who had been holding court at the head of the table, was not pleased. The shift in the room's energy was palpable, and the spotlight was no longer on her. The conversation which she had so carefully curated around the topics of her career success and Derek's latest venture had been hijacked by a sentimental story about her mother's old, irrelevant job. I saw the flash of annoyance in her eyes. She was a performer whose scene had just been stolen by a background actor. She needed to reclaim the focus, to steer the narrative back to herself, and she chose to do it with an act of such casual, stunning cruelty that it would forever be seared into my memory. I turned to go back to the kitchen, my heart warmed by David's kind words. When the other dinner guest, Derek's potential business partner, a loud, oafish man in an expensive suit, wrinkled his nose theatrically, the Brussels sprouts, which I had roasted with balsamic and bacon, had a strong, distinct and delicious aroma. "Whoa," the man said with a boorish laugh. "What's that smell? Smells like a hospital in here." It was a stupid, thoughtless comment, but it was the opening Chloe had been waiting for. It was her chance to turn the conversation about my nursing career, a topic that had just earned me a moment of respect, into a punchline. She seized the opening with the ruthless timing of a stand-up comedian. She threw her head back and let out a loud, high theatrical laugh, a sound designed to draw every eye in the room back to her. "Oh, don't worry, Mark," she said, her voice ringing with a false, bright cheerfulness. "That's just my mom." She looked down the table, her eyes finding mine, a small, cruel, triumphant smile on her lips. She wanted me to hear this. She wanted me to feel the full public force of this blow. "After 35 years as a palliative care nurse," she announced to the entire table, her voice a declaration of my shame, "she always smells a little like pee and poo." The words, so childish, so vulgar, so profoundly, deeply insulting, landed in the center of the dining room like a grenade. Pee and poo. The two words that sick, dying people and their caregivers dread most. The words that represent the final, most profound loss of dignity. She had taken my life's work, the sacred, difficult and honorable task of caring for the dying, the very thing that David Chen had just praised me for, and she had reduced it to the basest, most humiliating, most disgusting bodily functions. She had not just insulted me, she had insulted every patient I had ever cared for. She had insulted the memory of Mr. Henderson. She had desecrated the very core of my identity, and she had done it as a joke, a light, witty piece of dinner party banter, to impress her boss and to put her mother back in her place. For a heart-stopping second, a profound, shocked silence fell over the room. The grenade had landed, and everyone was waiting for it to explode. Then, the first sound. It was Derek. He let out a loud, braying laugh, a sycophantic, desperate sound, slapping the table with his hand. "Good one, babe," he roared, looking at his business partner Mark for approval. Mark, a man who clearly took his social cues from his host, joined in with a slightly more subdued, but no less cruel chuckle. A wave of shocked, awkward and deeply uncomfortable laughter rippled through some of the other guests. The ones who worked for Chloe's boss, the ones who wanted to stay on the right side of the evening's power dynamic. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of people laughing because they felt they were supposed to, the sound of social complicity. On the other side of the table, the reaction was starkly different. My sister Denise stared at her niece, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated, murderous fury. If looks could kill, my daughter would have been incinerated where she sat. David Chen, the man who had just praised my career, looked utterly horrified, his face pale with a mixture of shock and disgust. He looked from Chloe to me, his mouth slightly agape as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. But the most important reaction, the one that would change the course of the entire evening and of all our lives, was mine. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I did not run from the room in a flood of humiliated tears. All the emotion that had been churning inside me, the grief, the resentment, the slow-burning anger vanished in that single terrible moment. It was all burned away, cauterized by the white-hot heat of Chloe's insult, leaving behind a profound, terrifying and utterly silent calm. It was the calm of a pilot in a nosedive who suddenly stops fighting the controls and just sees the ground coming. It was the calm of a patient who has just received a terminal diagnosis and finally completely accepts it. It was the calm of a woman who had been pushed and pushed and pushed and had finally irrevocably reached her absolute limit. I just stood in the doorway, the platter of Brussels sprouts still in my hand, and I looked at my daughter. My face, I am told, was utterly blank. The warm, tired, accommodating face of Martha Green was gone, replaced by something still, cold and as unreadable as stone. A profound and terrifying silence descended upon me. The world outside of me, the laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses faded into a distant meaningless hum. In that moment of perfect terrible clarity I saw my daughter not as my child, but as a cruel ungrateful stranger who had just committed an unforgivable act of desecration in my home. The person I had been for 60 years, the patient mother, the accommodating host, the keeper of the peace, died in that doorway, and a new person, a woman I had not yet met, was about to be born. The moment of silent, terrible clarity stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. The laughter at the table had died down, replaced by a tense, awkward silence as the guests became aware of my profound and unnerving stillness. Slowly, and with a strange, deliberate grace that felt as if I were moving through water, I turned from the dining room and walked to the antique mahogany sideboard that stood against the wall. I placed the heavy silver platter of roasted Brussels sprouts down on its polished surface. The sound of the silver meeting the wood was a soft, definitive thud in the silent room. My hands were perfectly steady. I straightened up and turned back to face the room. I did not look at the laughing guests. I did not look at my horrified sister. I looked only at my daughter, Chloe, who was still sitting at the head of the table, a small, triumphant and utterly clueless smile on her face. I walked from the sideboard to the dining room table, my steps unhurried, my gaze never leaving her face. I stopped directly behind her chair. She had to crane her neck to look up at me, a subtle but significant shift in the evening's power dynamic. My voice when I spoke was not the warm, gentle tone of a mother. It was a voice I had never heard myself use before. It was not loud, but it was so cold, so clear and so devoid of any emotion that it seemed to cut through all other sound in the room, to suck the very warmth from the air. "Chloe," I said. It was not a question. It was a summons. "Get out." The two words were simple, quiet and utterly devastatingly absolute. Chloe's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of stunned, incredulous disbelief. She let out a small, nervous laugh. "What? Mom, what are you talking about? Stop being so dramatic. It was just a joke." "It was not a joke," I said, my voice still a flat, calm and terrifying monotone. "And I am not your mother, not anymore. I am the owner of this house, and you are no longer welcome in it. Get out." I was no longer speaking to my daughter. I was speaking to a trespasser. My words and the profound, unshakable authority with which they were delivered finally began to penetrate her bubble of arrogant self-assurance. A flicker of real fear, of dawning, horrified understanding appeared in her eyes. This was not a game. This was not a dramatic moment she could manage or spin. This was real. This was a reckoning. And it was happening right now, in the middle of her perfect dinner party, in front of the very people she was so desperate to impress. The action had been taken. The eviction had begun. Chloe stared at me, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "You can't be serious," she stammered, her voice a high, reedy whisper. "This is insane. We live here." "Not anymore," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble floor. I did not wait for her to argue further. I reached down and placed my hand on the back of her chair. With a calm, steady strength I didn't know I possessed, I pulled the chair back from the table. The legs scraped loudly on the hardwood floor, a harsh, ugly sound that underscored the ugliness of the moment. "Get up, Chloe," I said, my voice still a low and now dangerous command. She scrambled to her feet, her chair almost tipping over. Her face was pale with shock, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and a dawning childish terror. She was no longer the sophisticated, witty hostess. She was a stunned, disobedient child, being publicly disciplined. "You too, Derek," I said, my gaze shifting to my son-in-law, who was sitting frozen in his chair, his face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. He looked from me to his wife, his mind clearly unable to process the sudden violent implosion of his comfortable freeloading life. "Your children can stay the night. My sister will look after them," but the two of you need to leave. Now. My quiet, unshakable authority was more intimidating than any shout could have ever been. It was the authority of a woman who had been pushed past her limit. A woman who had nothing left to lose, a woman who was so profoundly, deeply, and finally done. Derek, a man whose entire life was a study in avoiding conflict and responsibility, actually started to get up, but Chloe grabbed his arm. "Don't you move," she hissed. She then turned her fury on me. "You can't do this. You're crazy. This is our home. All our things are here. You can't just throw us out." She was hysterical now, her voice a shrill, ugly shriek that bore no resemblance to the smooth, charming tones of the perfect hostess from just a few minutes before. The mask had not just slipped, it had been shattered. I did not argue. I did not engage. The time for words was over. I simply walked at her, took her firmly by the upper arm, and began to physically usher her out of the dining room. My grip was surprisingly strong. It was the grip of a nurse who has had to manage difficult patients. The grip of a woman who has finally found her strength. She stumbled after me, sputtering, protesting, threatening. "I'll call the police. I'll tell them you've lost your mind. You'll be sorry." Derek, finally jolted into action, followed us, his face a mask of panicked confusion. "Martha, wait, let's just calm down and talk about this." I ignored them both. I marched Chloe through the living room, past her horrified silent guests, and to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulled the door open, and propelled her out onto the front porch, into the cool dark night. I then turned to Derek, who was hovering in the entryway, and simply pointed. He scurried out after his wife, without another word. The eviction in its initial phase was complete. They were out. But the price of their humiliation, the bill for my own, was not yet paid in full. Chloe stood on the front porch, her beautiful expensive dress now looking cheap and ridiculous in the harsh glare of the porch light. The shock had worn off, replaced by a pure sputtering narcissistic rage. "You are insane," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the quiet suburban night. "A crazy old woman. We live here. All our clothes, our computers, our entire life is in that house. What are we supposed to do?" I stood in the doorway, a silent, implacable guardian. "That is no longer my concern," I said, my voice as cold as the night air. I was about to close the door on her, on them, on this entire ugly chapter of my life. But as I looked at her face, contorted with a rage that was entirely focused on her own inconvenience, and not at all on the monstrous cruelty of what she had said, I knew that simply evicting them was not enough. She had publicly humiliated me. She had, in front of an audience, tried to strip me of my dignity, my history, my very identity. Her punishment, I realized with a sudden chilling clarity, needed to be equally public. It needed to be a direct, tangible consequence of her own actions. Humiliation, I thought, has a price. With a calm that was terrifying to behold. Even to myself, I looked my daughter in the eye. "You are right," I said, my voice a low, dangerous murmur. "Your things are in my house. Let me get some for you." I closed and locked the door, leaving them stunned and sputtering on the porch. I did not go to the hall closet to get their coats. I turned and walked, with a slow, deliberate, and thunderous purpose, up the main staircase. I walked into the master bedroom. My bedroom, the room they had so casually and completely taken over. The air was thick with the scent of her expensive perfume, and his cloying cologne. The room was a chaotic mess of their belongings, a testament to their careless, entitled existence. I did not go to her closet to pack a sensible overnight bag. I went to the beautiful antique armoire where she kept her most prized possessions. Her designer clothes, the dresses, the handbags, the shoes that were the armor for her insecure, image-obsessed life. The very things she used to project the image of a success she had not earned. I opened the doors. I did not carefully select a few items. I simply reached in and, with a surge of pure primal strength, I began to pull them out, armful after armful. Silks, cashmeres, designer labels. I gathered a huge, chaotic bundle of her most expensive, most beloved clothes in my arms. I marched back down the stairs, the luxurious fabrics trailing behind me like a fallen banner. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and threw it open. Chloe and Derek were still on the porch. In the middle of a frantic, whispered argument, they stopped and stared at me, their mouths agape. I did not say a word. I simply walked past them, down the porch steps, and onto my perfectly manicured front lawn. And there, on the curb, under the cold, unforgiving glare of the street lamp, I threw the clothes. The bundle of silks and cashmeres of status and pretense landed in a messy, pathetic heap on the damp grass of the curb. "There," I said, my voice not a shout, but a clear, ringing declaration that carried across the quiet street. "You wanted your things. There they are." I turned back to my daughter, whose face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. "Humiliation," I said, the words a final, cold, and deeply satisfying verdict, "has a price." And with that I turned, walked back into my house and slammed the door, leaving them outside with the wreckage of their lives. The moment the front door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding home with a solid, final thud, the adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins, the cold, hard fury that had fueled my actions, vanished. My knees felt weak. I leaned my back against the solid wood of the door, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The storm had passed, and I was left standing in the wreckage. The house, which had been so full of noise and tension just moments before, was eerily silent. From outside I could hear Chloe's hysterical shrieking sobs, a sound of pure impotent rage. It was a sound I knew I would never forget. The dinner party, I realized with a jolt, was still technically in progress. I had completely forgotten about my guests. I turned from the door, my movements stiff and robotic, and walked back toward the dining room. The scene was one of utter awkward chaos. The guests, who had been the unwilling audience to the complete and total implosion of a family, were in the process of making hasty, embarrassed exits. They were gathering their coats and purses, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a desperate desire to be anywhere else. They murmured awkward, truncated apologies as I entered the room. "So sorry, Martha. A wonderful meal, we should be going." They could not look me in the eye. I had not just thrown my daughter out, I had shattered the fragile illusion of suburban civility, and they were all desperate to flee the scene of the crime. I just nodded, unable to speak, and let them go. Soon, only two people remained: my sister Denise and the man who had inadvertently started it all. David Chen. They were standing by the fireplace, their faces a mask of shared horror and concern. Denise came to me first. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't say anything, she just wrapped her strong, solid arms around me in a fierce, protective hug. I collapsed against her, my own sobs, the ones I had been holding back, finally breaking free. I cried for my daughter, for my grandchildren, for the terrible, ugly thing I had just done, and for the profound and terrifying relief I felt in having done it. "It's about damn time," Denise murmured into my hair, her voice a low, vicious growl of pure sisterly validation. "It's about damn time you stood up for yourself, Marty." David Chen approached us hesitantly, his kind face full of a deep and genuine concern. "Mrs. Green," he said, his voice soft, "I am so sorry. I had no idea my comment would lead to this." What she said was unforgivable. "It wasn't your fault, David," I said, my voice muffled by my sister's shoulder. "This has been coming for a very long time. You just happened to be there when the dam finally broke." He nodded, his eyes full of a sad understanding. "Is there anything I can do? Anything at all?" "No," I said, finally pulling away from my sister, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "You have both done enough. You stayed. Thank you." They helped me clear the wreckage of the disastrous dinner party, the half-eaten plates of expensive sea bass, the abandoned glasses of fine wine. As we worked, a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. The storm was over, the house was quiet, the toxic presence that had been poisoning my life was finally and irrevocably gone. The price had been astronomical, but the peace I was beginning to realize might just be worth it. The next day was a Saturday, and it was a day of tense, bitter, and almost completely silent transition. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, a large, yellow moving truck, a glaring, ugly symbol of their defeat, rumbled down my quiet street and parked in front of the house. Chloe and Derek arrived a few minutes later in a taxi. They did not look at me. They did not speak to me. Chloe's face was pale and swollen from a night of weeping, her eyes burning with a cold, resentful fury. Derek just looked defeated, a man whose comfortable, subsidized life had just been violently upended. They had a key. I had, in a final act of cold, procedural necessity, left a single spare key under the doormat for them. They were to use it to enter, pack their belongings, and then leave it on the kitchen counter when they were finished. Those had been my instructions, delivered via a single terse text message to my daughter in the middle of the night. I did not help them. I did not hinder them. I simply retreated to the kitchen, made myself a pot of strong black coffee, and sat at the small breakfast nook that overlooked the backyard. From there I could hear the sounds of their departure, but I did not have to witness it. The sounds were a symphony of resentment. The angry scrape of furniture being dragged across the hardwood floors. The sharp, percussive screech of packing tape being pulled from the roll. The low, furious and indistinct murmur of their voices as they worked. They were not just packing, they were exercising their presence from the house, and they were doing it with an angry, resentful energy. My sister Denise arrived around 10, carrying a box of fresh pastries. She didn't say a word about the moving truck outside. She just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat with me, a silent, solid pillar of support. Her presence was a quiet declaration. You are not alone in this. We sat for hours, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper, talking about everything and nothing. All the while the sounds of the silent move continued in the background, a tense, angry soundtrack to our quiet morning. At one point Chloe appeared in the kitchen doorway. She didn't look at me, she looked at the refrigerator. We have food in there, she said, her voice a flat, accusatory monotone. Are you going to pack it for us? Before I could even respond, Denise stood up. No, Chloe, she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Your mother is not going to pack your artisanal cheeses and your gluten-free bread for you. You have boxes. You have hands. You are a grown woman. Pack your own damn food. Chloe stared at her aunt, her face a mask of shocked fury, then turned on her heel and stormed away without another word. By late afternoon the sounds began to subside. The final box was loaded. The heavy rolling door of the moving truck slammed shut with a deafening final boom. A few minutes later I heard the click of the spare key being placed on the kitchen counter. Then the sound of the front door closing, gently this time, and then the rumble of the truck's engine as it pulled away from the curb. And then, silence. A deep, profound, and utterly beautiful silence. Denise and I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, just listening to it. The storm was over. The occupation had ended. The house was finally completely mine again. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying process of reclaiming my space, both physically and psychologically. The house, though empty of their bodies and their belongings, still held the faint, lingering ghost of their presence, a psychic residue of their disrespect and unhappiness. I needed to scrub it clean. I started with their rooms. The master bedroom, my old room, was the worst. It felt alien, a hotel room that had been occupied by careless, unhappy strangers. It smelled of her perfume, of his cologne. I threw open the windows, even in the crisp autumn air, and let the clean, cold wind blow through, chasing away the last vestiges of their scent. I stripped the bed, bundling the expensive high-thread count sheets Chloe had insisted on buying, and which I had paid for, into a black garbage bag. I did not wash them. I took them directly to the outside trash bin. It was a purely symbolic and deeply gratifying act of purification. I spent the next 2 days engaged in a frenzy of deep cleaning. I washed the walls. I shampooed the carpets. I polished every piece of furniture until it gleamed. I was not just cleaning my house. I was performing an exorcism, washing away the memory of their entitlement, one scrub at a time. When the rooms were physically clean, I began the work of reclaiming them aesthetically. The guest room, which Derek had used as his home office, a perpetually messy space filled with the ghosts of his failed ventures, was the first to be transformed. I packed away the ugly functional office furniture they had left behind, and moved in a beautiful, comfortable daybed, a small writing desk, and a shelf filled with my favorite novels. I turned it back into a proper guest room, a welcoming space for people I actually wanted to host. Then I turned my attention to the master bedroom. It needed a complete overhaul. The cool, impersonal gray that Chloe had insisted on painting the walls was the first thing to go. I spent a weekend, with my sister's cheerful and energetic help, repainting the room a bright, warm, and joyful shade of sunny yellow, the color of optimism, the color of a new beginning. I moved my own furniture back in, the familiar, well-loved pieces that had been relegated to the basement. I put my own pictures back on the walls, photos of Charles, of my parents, of a much younger, happier Chloe. I was not just redecorating, I was restoring my own history, my own narrative to the walls of my life. With every change, with every stroke of the paintbrush, with every piece of familiar furniture returned to its rightful place, the house began to feel like mine again. It began to breathe again. The tense, anxious energy that had permeated it for 2 years was slowly but surely being replaced by a quiet and deeply profound sense of peace. My home was no longer a hotel, no longer a stage for someone else's performance. It was my sanctuary once more. Life settled into a new quiet rhythm. The house was calm, orderly, and smelled only of lemon polish, old books, and the lavender I grew in the garden. The silence that I had once feared, the silence that had driven me to make the foolish decision to let them move in, was now my most cherished companion. It was the sound of my own thoughts, of my own peace. My grandchildren, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, were the innocent casualties of this war, and my heart ached for them. But after a few tense weeks of legal back and forth, a new arrangement was made. They were now with me every other weekend. Our time together was different now. It was quieter, more focused. I was not their default, always on-call babysitter. I was their grandmother. We baked cookies. We worked in the garden. We read stories. I was teaching them, in my own quiet way, the lessons of respect and kindness their parents had so spectacularly failed to learn. A month after the disastrous dinner party, a single thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was from Chloe. My hands trembled as I opened it. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, I thought it might be an apology, a letter of remorse, a first, tentative step toward reconciliation. It was not. The letter was 10 pages long, a rambling, bitter, and entirely self-pitying tirade. It was a masterwork of narcissistic revisionism. In her version of events, she was the victim. I was the cruel, unstable, and vindictive villain who had for no reason at all thrown her and her family out onto the street. She accused me of being jealous of her success. She accused me of deliberately sabotaging her career by embarrassing her in front of her boss. She accused me of traumatizing her children. The insult, the cruel public joke that had started it all, was dismissed in a single sentence as a light-hearted comment that my oversensitive nature had blown out of all proportion. There was not a single word of apology, not a flicker of remorse, not a hint of self-awareness. It was the desperate, angry screed of a person who was utterly incapable of accepting responsibility for her own actions. I read the letter once, standing in my quiet, sunlit kitchen. Then I walked over to the fireplace in the living room. It was a cold day and I had been planning to light a fire later. I decided not to wait. I crumpled the 10 pages of bitter self-serving lies into a tight ball. I placed it on the grate, surrounded by kindling. I struck a match, the small sharp sound a tiny explosion in the quiet room. I touched the flame to the edge of the paper. The letter caught fire immediately, the angry black words curling and turning to ash. I sat in my armchair and watched it burn, a strange, profound sense of peace settling over me. I was not burning a bridge. I was simply clearing away the wreckage. I thought of the price of humiliation, the phrase that had echoed in my mind on that terrible night. The price had been high. I may have lost my daughter, perhaps forever. But as I sat there, in my quiet, clean, and peaceful living room, a room that was finally and completely my own, I realized a deeper truth. The price of my own dignity, I now knew, was a bill I was no longer willing to pay. The final account was settled, and I was, at long last, at peace.